The quaint seaside village of St. Mawes-on-Sea, perched on a gentle cliff overlooking the churning grey waters of the English Channel, had always been a place where time seemed to move more slowly. The gulls cried overhead, and the sea spray mingled with the scent of freshly baked scones from the village taroom. It was early May, the days still crisp with a hint of winter's lingering chill, yet warm enough for promenades along the cliffside paths. The pastel-painted cottages that lined the cobbled streets bore the patina of decades, each shutter and wrought-iron balcony whispering the stories of the families who had lived and died there. Miss Jane Marple had arrived at the Seaside Hotel by invitation from her old friend, Lady Constance Fairchild, who had taken to holidaying at the establishment each spring. The hotel was a charming, if slightly faded, structure perched precariously on the cliffs, with turrets and gables that looked as though they had sprouted organically from the rocks themselves. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of lavender polish and sea air, mingled with the aroma of roasted meats from the dining room. The atmosphere was genteel, yet tinged with the faint tension of families on holiday. An undercurrent of delicate dramas played out beneath the veneer of polite smiles. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl and accompanied by her small wicker handbag, had taken a room on the second floor overlooking the beach. From her window she could watch the ebb and flow of tides, children building sandcastles, and the occasional angler who had risen before dawn to stake a claim on the rock-strewn shoreline. As she unpacked her modest luggage, she reflected on the nature of human folly. Holiday-makers, she knew, revealed themselves in small ways, a curt word over tea, a hasty glance, or a secretive envelope slipped into a coat pocket. It was during her afternoon tea in the hotel lounge that Miss Marple first began to notice the curious undercurrents of the household. The lounge, with its high windows and faded velvet armchairs, was a place where visitors congregated after lunch, exchanging polite conversation and, as Miss Marple suspected, quiet intrigues. Lady Constance Fairchild, a formidable woman with a penchant for observation, had already arrived. She was seated near the window, knitting a particularly elaborate lace shawl, her sharp eyes following every guest who entered the room. "Jane, you must meet some of our fellow guests," she said, her voice brisk but warm. "There's quite the gathering this season, everyone with their little secrets, I dare say." Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the steam curl about her spectacles as she surveyed the room. Her gaze settled on a group of four seated around a card table, laughing a little too loudly over a game of bridge. One of them, Mr. Geoffrey Staines, a thin man with an angular face and a meticulously groomed moustache, seemed to be monopolizing the conversation, while Mrs. Evelyn Staines, his younger wife, kept glancing nervously at her husband, as if anticipating an outburst. Nearby, Dr. Reginald Halsey, the local physician, and Miss Beatrice Linton, a governess with an air of quiet dignity, conversed over a pot of Earl Grey. Miss Marple noted the subtle ways Dr. Halsey's hand lingered near the sugar bowl, a habit, perhaps, or a minor nervous tic, and the restrained nods and polite smiles exchanged with Miss Linton, which seemed to Miss Marple fraught with unspoken tension. Lady Constance, noticing her friend's scrutiny, leaned closer and whispered, "Do be careful, Jane. There is always more behind these polite facades than meets the eye." Miss Marple inclined her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Indeed, Constance, one must simply know where to look. The first day passed in gentle, unremarkable fashion, with walks along the cliff paths and polite conversations over dinner. Yet, as evening fell and the sky turned a bruised purple, a subtle disturbance rippled through the hotel. It began with a faint, almost imperceptible sound from the corridor, a hurried step followed by a muffled thump. Guests paused in mid-conversation, glancing about, yet dismissed it as the wind or an inattentive maid. Miss Marple, however, felt a familiar prickle of intuition. She rose from her chair, adjusted her shawl, and made her way to the source. The corridor was dimly lit, the polished floor reflecting the glow of wall sconces. At the end of the hall, near room 7, a door stood ajar. Inside, the usually immaculate room appeared in disarray. A chair overturned, papers scattered across the carpet, and, most alarming, a faint, lingering smell of almonds, a scent Miss Marple had learned to associate with more than mere confectionery. Her gaze settled on Mr. Geoffrey Staines, who lay slumped across the bed, his face pale and unresponsive. A small vial rested beside his hand, its contents spilled onto the sheet. The guests, drawn by the commotion, clustered in the corridor, their expressions a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Call for Dr. Halsey." Lady Constance's voice rang out, sharp with urgency. Within moments the physician arrived, examining Mr. Staines with swift, professional detachment. Miss Marple watched quietly, noting the brief flicker of concern that passed across Dr. Halsey's face before it was replaced by calm authority. "Poisoning," he said quietly after a careful examination. "Bitter almonds, cyanide almost certainly. We must summon the authorities immediately." A hush fell over the hotel. The seaside evening, once so serene, now seemed charged with menace. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, considered the tableau. Poison, she reflected, was a crime of precision and planning. It spoke not of impulse, but of calculation, a deliberate hand, guided by motive, hidden behind polite society's mask. As the constable was summoned, and guests were confined to the lounge for questioning, Miss Marple's sharp mind began to knit together threads that were invisible to others. Who could wish Mr. Staines harm, and why? What hidden grudges or jealousies simmered beneath the surface of this genteel gathering? And, most importantly, what small details might reveal the culprit? Details overlooked by all but an observant observer like herself. The storm outside, once merely a backdrop to a tranquil seaside holiday, seemed now to echo the turbulence within the hotel's walls. Miss Marple took her seat by the window, gazing out at the darkening waves, her mind already piecing together the first fragments of a puzzle that promised to be as intricate as it was deadly. In that moment, she knew that the next few days would require all her cunning, patience, and knowledge of human nature to uncover the truth. The following morning dawned grey and misty, the sea washing the cliff-side rocks with a relentless rhythm. Inside the Seaside Hotel, the air was heavy with tension. Guests walked cautiously through the corridors, whispering in hushed tones, their voices barely concealing curiosity, fear, or perhaps shame. Miss Marple, ever observant, sipped her tea at the small breakfast table set beside the bay window of the lounge. From her vantage point, she could see the hotel staff moving with careful precision, clearing away crumbs from yesterday's breakfast, as if trying to restore a semblance of normality. Lady Constance, seated opposite her, broke the silence. "It is most distressing, Jane. One expects a holiday to be a reprieve, and yet here we are, a murder within our midst. I scarcely know where to begin." Miss Marple's sharp eyes twinkled with a mixture of curiosity and resolve. "Indeed, Constance, but as you know, mischief is often hidden in plain sight. The key is to observe not only what is said, but what is left unsaid, and what people do in moments when they believe no one is watching." It was with that thought that she began her careful inquiries. She first approached Mrs. Evelyn Staines, who, despite her husband's tragic fate, had made herself as unobtrusive as possible. Evelyn was a delicate-looking woman, her hair impeccably styled, hands trembling as she arranged her napkin. Mrs. Staines Miss Marple began gently. "I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but I should like to ask a few questions about yesterday evening." Evelyn's eyes flickered with something between grief and fear. "Of course, Miss Marple, anything to help. It was so sudden. I barely understood what was happening." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft yet insistent. "You were with your husband during dinner?" "Yes, mostly. He seemed tense, but I thought it was the usual. His work, the worry over our affairs, nothing unusual, only that he spent quite some time speaking with Dr. Halsey before dessert." Miss Marple made a mental note of this. Doctors, after all, were rarely involved in intimate arguments unless the subject concerned health, inheritance, or secrets. Next, she sought out Dr. Reginald Halsey, who was pacing the corridor outside the dining room. The physician's hands were clasped behind his back, his expression professionally restrained, yet Miss Marple could detect the slightest tightness at the corner of his mouth. "Dr. Halsey," she began, her tone deliberately casual, "may I ask about Mr. Staines? I understand you were with him shortly before the unfortunate incident." "Yes, Miss Marple," he replied. "He mentioned feeling unwell after dinner, which is why I advised him to retire early. I suspected nothing of this severity. Cyanide is uncommon in our part of the world." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Indeed, yet someone had access. Were there any visitors, or perhaps servants, who might have had cause to dislike him?" Dr. Halsey hesitated briefly, then shook his head. "Not that I am aware of. Geoffrey was not a man easily crossed. He could be irritable, yes, but rarely vengeful. However, there are always subtleties in human relations, sometimes hidden from the unobservant eye." Miss Marple made a note to explore these subtleties more closely. Subtle tensions were, after all, her specialty. She then turned her attention to Miss Beatrice Linton, whose dignified air and quiet voice masked an intensity that Miss Marple had seen before in young governesses and secretaries. Beatrice had been employed by the Staines family for several years, travelling with them to various holiday destinations. "I understand you have known the Staines for some time?" Miss Marple inquired as they sat in the small library near the lounge. "Yes, Miss Marple, I have accompanied them on many occasions. I knew Geoffrey well enough to see when he was uneasy." Beatrice paused, biting her lip. "Yesterday evening I noticed something odd. He received a note while we were in the lounge, and I thought it strange, though I did not look closely. He seemed troubled afterward. A note." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Whoever had sent it might have done so with a calculated intent, either to unsettle or to signal. She made a mental note to inquire discreetly about any correspondence Mr. Staines had received in the days leading up to his death. The day passed in a haze of questions and observations. Miss Marple, though polite and seemingly serene, moved like a shadow among the guests, noting small gestures, minor contradictions, and fleeting glances. Mr. Thomas Carow, another guest, a retired banker with a fascination for local history, caught her attention. He spoke at length about the hotel's storied past, weaving tales of smuggling and clandestine affairs. Yet beneath the anecdotal charm, Miss Marple detected a thread of possessiveness, perhaps envy, that might play into motive. By mid-afternoon she requested a meeting with the hotel manager, Mr. Harold Finch, a man of nervous disposition who prided himself on discretion. "Miss Marple, the police have been thorough, I assure you," he said, wringing his hands. "All access to the rooms is accounted for, yet I cannot fathom who could do such a thing." "Of course," she replied, her voice calm but probing. "But tell me, Harold, has anyone behaved oddly since the incident? Guests, staff, anyone?" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Well, I did notice the new maid, Lucy, acting rather skittish. She keeps glancing at the cupboard where the vials are kept, and the chef, well, He's unusually quiet this morning. Too quiet, perhaps." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Quietness can conceal much, as can nervous glances. I shall take note of these observations." It was in the early evening, as the first lamp-light shimmered against the misty sea, that Miss Marple made her most significant discovery. While taking a solitary walk along the cliff path to clear her mind, she observed Mrs. Evelyn Staines speaking furtively with a man whose face she did not immediately recognize. They exchanged a folded piece of paper, then parted quickly, each glancing over their shoulder as though fearful of being seen. Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple reflected on this. The gesture was too deliberate to be innocent. She resolved to ask Evelyn about it, though with the utmost tact. Meanwhile, she continued to observe subtle dynamics among the guests. The retired banker seemed eager to curry favour with Lady Constance, perhaps hoping to gain an invitation to the Fairchild estate. Dr. Halsey maintained an impeccable exterior, yet she noted a flicker of irritation when Miss Marple questioned him about medical histories and poisons, and Beatrice Linton, quiet though she was, held herself in a manner that suggested she knew more than she let on. By dinner the atmosphere was strained, conversation was muted, punctuated by polite laughter that never reached the eyes. Miss Marple sat quietly, listening and watching, noting the way Dr. Halsey poured himself an extra glass of wine, while others' hands trembled over cutlery. Geoffrey's widow, Evelyn, seemed determined to appear composed, yet the flush on her cheeks betrayed agitation. Afterwards, in the privacy of the lounge, Miss Marple reflected on her observations. She considered the list of potential motives: marital discord, jealousy, financial gain, and professional rivalry. The poisoned man had, for all appearances, been calm, even content, yet someone had taken a calculated step to end his life. And in such a close-knit circle, the culprit was likely someone already familiar with the household's routines. It was then that Miss Marple realized that the small details, the subtle gestures, the furtive notes, the nervous habits, were pieces of a larger puzzle. To the untrained eye they were mere coincidences. To her they were threads connecting motive, opportunity, and means. As she retired to her room that night, Miss Marple penned a careful list of observations. She noted the mysterious note Geoffrey received the night before his death, Evelyn Staines' furtive exchange along the cliffs, Dr. Halsey's minor, yet telling, signs of irritation, Beatrice Linton's quiet but observant presence, the hotel staff's nervous glances, and unusual behaviour. With these fragments, she began to sketch a web of connections, each strand suggesting a possible suspect, a hidden motive, or a secret best left unspoken. Yet Miss Marple knew that patience, observation, and the careful coaxing of confidences would reveal the truth. And so, as the storm of human passions quietly stirred beneath the veneer of seaside civility, Miss Marple settled into the familiar rhythm of her methodical mind. She knew that the next steps, the interviews, the uncovering of secrets, the subtle testing of alibis, would require both delicacy and resolve. The investigation had only just begun, and already the first threads of a tangled mystery were beginning to unravel. The morning after the tense dinner, St. Mawes-on Sea was shrouded in a soft, persistent drizzle. The cliffs, usually so picturesque, appeared stark and windswept, the waves lapping against the rocks below with relentless, indifferent persistence. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar tweed coat and knitted shawl, made her way quietly down to the hotel lounge. She had slept little, her mind turning over every observation from the previous day, assembling fragments into an ever more intricate puzzle. Lady Constance was already seated, sipping tea with a distant gaze. "Jane, I wish to heaven the police would act more swiftly. I find their methodical questioning most lacking in insight. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Constance, insight is seldom delivered in grand declarations. It comes from noticing the small, seemingly unimportant details. People reveal themselves in the most unexpected ways. Indeed, Miss Marple was about to test that truth. Her first step that morning was to revisit the scene of the crime. Room 7, now under the careful supervision of the constable, remained untouched save for a few measured inspections. Miss Marple noted the placement of the vial, the angle at which it had fallen, and the faint residue of powder on the edge of the bedside table. She mused quietly to herself. The hand that poured this would have needed calm, dexterity, and knowledge. A hurried, nervous person could scarcely manage such precision. From there, she moved to questioning the hotel staff, beginning with Lucy, the new maid whose behaviour the manager had found suspicious. The young woman trembled as Miss Marple approached. "Lucy, dear, I simply wish to understand what you saw last night," Miss Marple said gently. "No harm will come from speaking truthfully." Lucy's hands clutched her apron. I didn't see much, Miss Marple, only Mr. Staines taking a letter from the envelope tray in the hall. He seemed worried, yes, very worried, and later I heard voices, Mrs. Staines and some gentleman talking in the corridor. I shouldn't have listened, really, but—" Miss Marple made a note of this. The envelope tray in the hall, a letter taken in private, a conversation overheard. It confirmed the earlier observation of Evelyn Staines' furtive behaviour, but raised further questions. Next, she turned her attention to Dr. Halsey, who was busy cataloguing vials and medications in the small dispensary. "Dr. Halsey," Miss Marple began, "you mentioned yesterday that cyanide is rare in these parts, yet someone obtained it. How might one acquire it in a hotel of this modest scale?" The doctor paused, his composure unshaken, though his eyes flickered momentarily. "Technically, it is accessible only through medical or industrial channels. It is not something a guest could casually obtain." Miss Marple noted the hesitation. "But one could theoretically smuggle it in?" she asked softly. "Yes," he replied, though the faint tightness of his lips betrayed his own apprehension. With that clue in mind, Miss Marple focused on motives. She considered each guest in turn, seeking the threads that might link them to Geoffrey Staines' death. Evelyn Staines, the wife, grief, stricken but perhaps anxious about inheritance or marital unhappiness. Dr. Halsey, the physician, trusted yet capable of minor concealments. Could professional resentment play a part? Beatrice Linton, long-time governess, loyalty or resentment? She knew the family dynamics intimately. Thomas Carew, retired banker, envious, perhaps greedy, or simply meddlesome. Hotel staff, nervous, observant, possibly manipulated or coerced. Later that day, Miss Marple joined Lady Constance for a walk along the cliff path. The wind whipped around them, tugging scarves and skirts. Here, in the open air, Miss Marple found space for contemplation. "Jane," Constance said, "I feel something has been overlooked. That young maid Lucy, she seems frightened, yes, but is that all? Could someone have used her, perhaps, without her knowledge?" "Quite likely, Constance. Fear is a powerful instrument. People see only what they are permitted to see, and it is the clever manipulator who keeps the rest hidden." Her mind returned to the mysterious note Geoffrey had received and the furtive meeting along the cliffs she had witnessed. These threads suggested a level of premeditation, and the thought occurred to Miss Marple that the crime was not born solely of passion, but carefully calculated. That afternoon an unexpected visitor arrived, Inspector Fielding, sent from the local constabulary. He was polite but slightly brusque, eager to impose order on the unruly human tangle. "Miss Marple, I understand you have been observing. Any insights to share?" he asked, with an eye toward professional scepticism. "I have observed," Miss Marple replied, "that people rarely act without reason, and when they do, small details betray them. Consider the note, the conversation on the cliff, the positioning of the vial, and the tiny residue of powder left untouched. Each piece tells a story if one listens closely enough. Inspector Fielding raised an eyebrow. Sounds promising, though I hope your stories are more concrete than poetic. Miss Marple, unperturbed, responded with quiet wit. Poetry often captures truth in ways blunt reports cannot, Inspector. As evening approached, the hotel experienced another stir. A guest discovered a torn fragment of paper behind the lounge radiator, bearing a partially legible message. Cannot trust. Meet. Tonight. Consequences. The fragment ignited whispers throughout the hotel. Could this note have been sent by the murderer to warn, manipulate, or mislead? Miss Marple considered both possibilities. Either a guilty hand was careless, leaving evidence, or an innocent party was trying to shield themselves by creating confusion. It was then that a further red herring emerged. A small gold locket belonging to Evelyn Staines was found tucked beneath a sofa cushion in the lounge. Within, a miniature portrait of Geoffrey revealed a cheerful, oblivious expression, seemingly untouched by worry. Yet Miss Marple, ever perceptive, noticed that the locket was freshly cleaned, suggesting someone had recently handled it, perhaps to remove fingerprints or evidence. Over the course of the night, Miss Marple conducted quiet, discreet interviews. She noted that Thomas Carrow had pressed repeatedly for news of inheritance matters, while Beatrice Linton had lingered too long in the room where Geoffrey had been poisoned, claiming she was arranging personal effects. Even Dr. Halsey, though outwardly calm, had been strangely insistent about the timeline of events, emphasizing the exact moment of death. By late evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her room, reflecting on the day's revelations. Several threads now intertwined. Evelyn Staines' furtive exchanges and nervous behaviour, suggesting involvement or awareness of a plan. The mysterious note and fragment, possibly a threat or a warning, introducing ambiguity. Dr. Halsey's precise knowledge of poisons and defensive posture raising suspicion. Beatrice Linton's lingering presence, intimate knowledge of household routines could facilitate a crime. Thomas Carrow's nosiness and fixation on inheritance potential motive, though less likely opportunity. Hotel staff nervousness they may have seen or unwittingly assisted without comprehension. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The web was intricate, layered with misdirection, yet each thread contained its own truth. The twists, the misleads, the false trails, the petty jealousies were part of the pattern. One had only to examine not what was said, but what was left unsaid. She knew that the next day would be crucial. Hidden motives would surface, secrets would slip through carefully maintained facades, and perhaps a final clue would emerge to narrow the field. Miss Marple had the patience for this slow unravelling, the quiet determination to observe without alarming the suspects, and the subtle wit to coax confidences from even the most guarded hearts. As the clock chimed midnight, she sat by the window, gazing at the storm-tossed sea below. She thought of the small details, the way Evelyn's hands shook while serving tea, the precise manner in which Dr. Halsey handled his instruments, Beatrice's thoughtful pauses before answering, and even the maid Lucy's tremulous glances. In that quiet reflection, Miss Marple felt the first threads of certainty weaving into place. The crime was intricate, yes, but not beyond comprehension. All that remained was to allow the puzzle to unfold, to watch, listen, and patiently wait for the final revelations to come into view. The following morning, a pale sun struggled to break through a veil of fog over St. Mawes-on-Sea. The waves below the cliffs were restless, a mirror to the undercurrents of anxiety and tension swirling within the Seaside Hotel. Miss Marple, as usual, was up early, sitting at the small writing desk in her room, arranging her notes, observations, and recollections. Every glance, every gesture, and every word spoken the previous days had been carefully logged in her mind. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is far more revealing than any confession. She began by reviewing the key facts. The victim, Geoffrey Staines, found dead in his room from cyanide poisoning. The suspects, Evelyn Staines' wife, doctor, Reginald Halsey, physician, Beatrice Linton, governess, Thomas Carrow, retired banker, and hotel staff, particularly Lucy. Suspicious events, mysterious note received by Geoffrey, Evelyn's clandestine meeting, torn fragment behind the radiator, the locket, unusual handling of the vial, and the timing of everyone's movements. Miss Marple sipped her tea and recalled Evelyn's furtive exchanges along the cliffs. People act differently when they are guilty and when they are frightened, she noted. Fear alone can compel deception, even from the innocent. Her first step that morning was to revisit Evelyn Staines, who seemed calmer than the previous day, but still visibly anxious. Mrs. Staines, Miss Marple began in her gentle, unassuming manner. Yesterday, I saw you speaking with someone along the cliffs. Might I ask who it was? Evelyn flushed. It was only a friend of my sister, Jane. She came to speak with me about Geoffrey's health. He had received a letter that worried him greatly. I was merely confiding in her. Miss Marple nodded, noting the story's plausibility. Yet the detail about the letter piqued her interest. If Geoffrey had been upset by correspondence, someone had a motive for disturbing him before the poisoning. Next, Miss Marple sought Beatrice Linton, who was tending the small flower arrangements in the lounge. The governess's posture was impeccable, yet her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a vase of roses. Miss Linton, Miss Marple began, I am trying to understand the sequence of yesterday evening. You were with Mr. Staines prior to dinner. Yes, Beatrice replied, her voice calm but guarded. I was arranging the study for his evening reading. He was preoccupied, occasionally stepping aside to answer the telephone or speak with the doctor. He seemed uneasy, but I did not think it my place to pry. Miss Marple's mind raced. Beatrice's knowledge of the household's routines gave her the means to administer poison unnoticed. She also recalled the governess lingering near the scene earlier, under the pretext of arranging Mr. Staines' personal effects. Turning her attention to Dr. Halsey, Miss Marple arranged to meet him in the small dispensary. The doctor was meticulous in his examination of instruments, his expression professionally serene. Dr. Halsey, she began innocently, would you say it is common for a cyanide vial to be obtained with such ease? No, he replied, his voice clipped, highly unlikely. Only someone familiar with poisons or in possession of medical connections could manage it. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curiosity, nothing more. A small puzzle I enjoy resolving. The doctor frowned, perhaps sensing the subtle accusation beneath her gentle words. A puzzle, Miss Marple, that leads nowhere. Cyanide is a very particular substance. She made a mental note of the defensive tone. It was a minor clue, but with her experience, she knew small things often revealed truth more than overt actions. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested a gathering of all the key guests in the lounge, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the remainder of their holiday. As the clock ticked, the room became heavy with polite murmurs, punctuated by nervous glances. She, however, remained composed, knitting quietly as she observed the faces before her. I have been reflecting, she began softly, on the unfortunate passing of Mr. Staines. It is a curious case, is it not? So sudden, so precise, yet not without subtle hints along the way. A faint murmur rippled through the room. Miss Marple allowed a pause before continuing. The first hint was a letter he received the evening before. Someone clearly intended to disturb or threaten him. I understand, Mrs. Staines, that you spoke with a friend regarding it." Evelyn Staines stiffened but nodded. "Yes, I confided in her. I wished only to understand what had upset Geoffrey." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, but it is not letters alone that reveal intent. Consider the vial placed with care upon the bedside table, the powder almost invisible yet significant. Only a hand familiar with chemicals and precision could manage such a task." All eyes turned to Dr. Halsey, whose lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple continued gently, "Dr. Halsey, your knowledge of poisons is unsurpassed, yet knowledge alone does not dictate action. One must also have motive." The doctor's composure faltered slightly. I assure you, I had no motive." Miss Marple's gaze shifted. "Perhaps not, yet motives are not always evident to others. Sometimes they are born of petty grievances, jealousy, or even a sense of entitlement." She then turned her attention to Beatrice Linton. "And you, Miss Linton, you have been close to this family for many years, have observed their routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. You must understand the temptation to act when one perceives injustice, or when one believes oneself overlooked." Beatrice paled, but remained silent, a subtle confession in her hesitation. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she allowed the silence to stretch. Then, with quiet precision, she spoke. The final clue was small, almost insignificant, the torn fragment behind the radiator. It spoke of warning, of consequences, yet it was carefully placed to mislead anyone who might stumble upon it. Clever, yes, but ultimately revealing. Evelyn gasped. "Jane, what are you implying?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I am implying only that human nature, left to its devices, tends to leave traces. Every lie, every secret, every attempt at concealment has a footprint, and when observed carefully, those footprints can lead us to the truth." All eyes shifted, tense and expectant. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside. "I believe we now know who acted, and why." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "The poison was administered deliberately, yet not impulsively. The hand must have been calm, precise, familiar with both chemicals and the household. The motive was neither chance nor sudden anger. It was planned, calculated, born of resentment and a sense of entitlement that had grown over years of quiet subservience." The room remained silent, each guest anticipating the revelation that would follow. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she added, "The person responsible is someone who had access, knowledge, and the opportunity, and yet wished to appear innocent. A hand guided by experience, yet betrayed by subtle signs, lingering too long, nervous gestures, defensive tones, and the faint misplacement of objects." Finally, she fixed her gaze on Beatrice Linton. "Miss Linton, I believe the evidence, both direct and circumstantial, points to you. You knew Mr. Staines' routines intimately, had access to the room, and understood the effect of cyanide. Your loyalty to the family was unquestioned outwardly, yet hidden beneath that loyalty was a grievance. A sense that your service had been taken for granted, the letter, the timing, the placement of the vial, all orchestrated with care, and yet the small fragment of paper, the trembling hands, the lingering presence, these were your undoing." Beatrice's eyes widened, her calm facade crumbling. I never meant, I only wanted him to understand." Her voice broke, tears welling. "He dismissed me, mocked me in small ways, never thanked me for my years of service. I only wanted to frighten him to teach him a lesson I never thought he would." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Intent and consequence are often misaligned, my dear, and in the end the truth emerges, as it always does." As the hotel guests absorbed the revelation, Dr. Halsey approached quietly, placing a reassuring hand on Miss Marple's shoulder. "Remarkable, Miss Marple. You've uncovered what others overlooked." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is rarely a question of cleverness, Doctor. It is a question of careful observation, understanding human nature, and noting the small details that everyone else dismisses. By evening, the constable had taken Beatrice Linton into custody. The hotel returned to its usual rhythm, though the shadow of the recent events lingered. Guests whispered quietly in the corridors, and the staff moved with measured care, aware that even the most ordinary of days could conceal extraordinary events. Miss Marple, sitting once again by her window, gazed out at the sea, its relentless rhythm unchanged. People, she reflected, often act on impulses shaped by a lifetime of small grievances. The hand may tremble, the voice may falter, yet in the end the truth can be discerned if one has patience enough to observe. She poured herself a cup of tea, allowing the warmth to soothe her mind. In the stillness of the Seaside Hotel, she considered the final lesson of the case, that human nature, complex and capricious, always leaves behind traces, no matter how small or carefully concealed. And it was those traces, when observed with patience and understanding, that revealed the hidden workings of the human heart. The morning after the revelation dawned crisp and clear, the fog of suspicion finally lifting from St. Mawes on sea. Sunlight glinted off the restless waves below the cliffs, casting a glittering path across the water, as though nature itself had been waiting for the truth to emerge. Within the Seaside Hotel, a hush of contemplation hung in the air, tempered by a quiet sense of relief. The mystery that had held the house in anxious suspense was resolved, yet the events of the previous days remained vivid in the minds of all present. Miss Marple, seated near the bay window, with her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, observed the activity in the lounge. Guests moved with more ease than they had in the past days, yet a trace of lingering unease remained. The shadow of the crime had passed, but human nature had left its mark, and in some cases it was indelible. Lady Constance Fairchild approached, her expression a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Jane, I cannot imagine how you managed to piece it together so swiftly. Beatrice Linton, I never would have suspected her." Miss Marple smiled faintly, knitting needles clicking softly. "People rarely act in ways that betray them outright, Constance. Yet there are always small, revealing signs, the tremble of a hand, the hesitation in a word, the glances we think no one observes. It is those threads that, when woven together, reveal the full tapestry of a person's intentions." Indeed, Miss Marple's observations had led to Beatrice Linton's confession. The governess, confronted with the weight of her actions, had admitted the crime quietly to Inspector Fielding and the constable. "It was never meant to kill him," she had whispered, her voice trembling, "only to frighten him, to make him see how I had suffered, how I had been overlooked. I never imagined it would end this way." The constable had nodded solemnly. "Intent does not absolve the consequences, Miss Linton, but your honesty now is a step toward resolution." Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance between intention and action. So often, people allowed small grievances to fester, nurturing resentment that eventually erupted in harmful ways. Yet, as she had observed in this case, even the most carefully concealed actions left behind faint, telling signs. As the morning progressed, the hotel staff worked quietly to restore the house to order. The room where Geoffrey Staines had met his tragic end was closed off for investigation and then carefully cleaned and rearranged. Small gestures, straightening a chair, dusting the edges of a table, polishing the silver tea sets, served as symbols of normality, returning after the disruption of human folly. Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, noting how even in this season of renewal the shadow of recent events lingered. The flowers were in full bloom, yet the petals seemed more delicate than usual, as though the world itself had been tempered by the tragedy. She stopped to watch a young couple walking along the path, their laughter light, their concerns ordinary. It was a comforting sight, Life, she reflected, continued. Lady Constance joined her, carrying a small basket of freshly picked primroses. "Jane, do you not find it remarkable how quickly people return to routine once the immediate threat has passed?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Constance, yet the lessons remain. People forget quickly, but memory lingers in small ways. The way someone avoids certain subjects, the cautious tone of conversation, the subtle shifts in relationships. These are the remnants of experience." Later, after a modest lunch, Miss Marple was summoned to the lounge, where the remaining guests had gathered. The atmosphere was polite, measured, and filled with a subdued curiosity. It was time, Miss Marple knew, to explain in detail the sequence of events and bring clarity to the confusion. She addressed the group calmly, her voice gentle yet authoritative. "Yesterday we saw the culmination of a complex series of actions carefully hidden behind the trappings of ordinary life. Mr. Staines received a letter that disturbed him, though the contents were not immediately known to anyone. Mrs. Staines, concerned for her husband, attempted to provide support. Others in the household, staff and fellow guests, acted according to habit, unaware of the subtle manipulations at play. All eyes were fixed on her, attentive yet apprehensive." Miss Marple continued. "The person who caused Mr. Staines' death was Beatrice Linton, who had served the household for many years. Her knowledge of the family's routines, access to the private quarters, and understanding of poisons gave her both the means and opportunity. She administered a small dose of cyanide, intending only to frighten, yet the consequences were tragically fatal. Beatrice sat quietly, her head bowed, the confession earlier made now contextualized by Miss Marple's careful explanation. "Why?" asked Thomas Carow, his voice unsteady. "What could drive someone to such an act?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "It is often not passion or greed alone, Mr. Carow. It is resentment nurtured over years, small slights that accumulate in the mind. Miss Linton felt overlooked, unappreciated, and sought to redress what she perceived as a wrong. Unfortunately, her plan exceeded her control. The result was death. Unintentional but real." Dr. Halsey, seated nearby, nodded thoughtfully. "It is remarkable how well you observed the subtle clues, Miss Marple. The fragment of paper behind the radiator, the furtive movements of the maid, the handling of the vial, all so small, yet together they revealed the truth." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "Attention to detail is often undervalued, Doctor, yet it is in the details that human nature most honestly expresses itself." Evelyn Staines, still pale but calmer, spoke softly. "Jane, I cannot thank you enough. It is a terrible relief to know the truth. I only wish Geoffrey could have known how it was discovered before it was too late." Miss Marple reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Sometimes, Mrs. Staines, understanding the truth allows us to forgive, to learn, and to move forward. The dead cannot benefit from vengeance, but the living can find peace." With the formal explanations concluded, the guests gradually returned to their rooms, conversations soft and subdued, yet tinged with a newfound clarity. The hotel staff moved more confidently now, aware that the disturbance had passed, and that the resolution of the mystery had restored order. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon walking along the cliff path, observing the sea and the gentle stirrings of village life. The waves were constant, their rhythm unchanging, indifferent to the turmoil of human affairs. Yet, she reflected, the truth had been revealed not by force, but by patience, observation, and understanding. Returning to the lounge later, she found Lady Constance arranging a small tea service. "Jane," she said, "I do believe the hotel itself feels lighter now. Even the walls seem relieved." Miss Marple smiled. "The burden of secrecy is heavier than any storm, Constance. Once revealed, the air itself seems clearer, the world a little gentler." By evening, the Seaside Hotel had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Guests mingled politely in the lounge, tea and conversation flowing as before, though the memory of the past days lingered in small ways, an extra glance at a neighbour, a moment of hesitation before speaking, the subtle awareness that human behaviour was more complex than it appeared. Miss Marple, settled once again near the bay window, observed the last light glimmer across the water. She reflected on the case, the people, and the nature of human folly. In the end, it had been small details unnoticed by others that revealed the truth: a trembling hand, a lingering glance, the careful handling of a vial, the subtle discrepancies in timing, all mysteries, she thought, could be solved with patience, perception, and understanding of human nature. And the lessons of St. Maur's on sea would remain with her as subtle reminders of the power of observation and the quiet, unassuming brilliance of careful thought. As she poured herself a final cup of tea and watched the sun sink behind the cliffs, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The hotel, the village, and indeed the people themselves had returned to their natural rhythms. Calm had been restored, justice of a sort served, and life, ever resilient, moved forward once more. And in the quiet of the evening, the gentle lull of the sea, the Seaside Hotel, and its inhabitants all seemed at last to breathe freely again.